Good evening. This is Ajdan Karadenis. Now, I want to give you a brief synopsis of a pinpoint of history of where we are today. I want to try to keep it in layman's term as much as I can. Okay, we're gonna go. Back to 1990, 93. Okay, now this is the geopolitics. This is after Clinton came into and served 2 terms and balanced the budget. Democratic oath to the Constitution of his domestic policies, right? And they knew his second term was going to end, and at this time he tried to garner the peace treaty initiative in Israel, right? And that goes back over 3 decades. It's a very, at my age, I understand, but if you put in context, it's a very long period of brief of history. So, and after that indication of what happened, they knew who was going to succeed. It would be either a Democrat or a Republican, right? And being Gore, he ran as vice president and he lost, right? And we know that election was vital for Bush's doctrine, because even in hindsight, if you ask Gore, would you want in that way hostile adversity as Republicans did or not, is not the capitulation you would say today as an argument. So he lost, when we look at that, the hanging chads, and, they're driving their grandmothers, Republicans, hey, you need to get the vote, right? And then they would be disparaging when they try to put election ballots in certain rural areas in Florida, and they would have lineups like they're going grocery shopping. Sorry, I don't mean the pun for that, right? But then to get them, they would say you'll buy your groceries, or we will pay, and then they would get people, and they would gerrymander, and there would be a different out because they discourage underprivileged neighborhoods to vote, right? And that's what they try to do. So at this time, if there was any participation in the electoral fraud, and that was the first time America went to bed not knowing who the president was on election day. So henceforward, Jeb Bush was his governor, and if he had overruled, and they're using now laws to protect the idea of if he won or not, who would decide that. So at the end of the day, Gore fought it, and he could have finished it again, and they went into Iraq. Okay, so there's other issues going to what happened inlays and what we know that. But now we're talking about when this became predominant with Iraq and Iran. And between Iraq and Iran, they lost maybe millions of people. You know that. Like the fight between Iraq and Iran. And so America capitulated with Saddam, right? And then they said, okay, we make business with you, right? But then when he decided, when the UAE, United Arab, had a foothold, right? They knew that he was using other ways. And he goes, I'm backing off these guys to help you. What are you doing? Because a lot of men died for that idea. So, at this time they put the pollutants in the air, and then they had to clean up their own backyard, right? And then after, what happened entailed was the idea how they looked at the commerce, right? Because the backing of that was also the collapse of the Greeks' economy and how the UAE rescued them. Because at this time, they go, what would happen, in context, if they would have said, if the oil prices, we would see arguments for or against, like how people might see, and that's the idea that the government goes as an administration. They're no more powerful than the people are, and they forget that. So, and afterwards, when they went into Iraq, they destabilized it, right? And then it was a very bad episode in history. And then this forward, when we ask about, like, for example, there's documentation of what happened in northern Iraq about Kurds, Kurdistan. Right now, This is what they ask you about, and this is what other journalists have found, right? These were facilities built by American technology. It was built there, shipped there, and they asked who they would need it for, and they say the Iraqis. And they go, what would the purpose be for that, right? And then we found out those parts were assembled in America and put there, shipped under facility. Now, when you invite UN and they did that, and that's what happened, all right? So I said, you got to get the UN people in there who are legitimized, right? And they would say, show me where these mass destruction, right? So before they went in there, the U.S. already planned to go in, right? We know that, right? And that's why I don't understand. It was that the hostility was being grown in front of the American studio, convincing them with masses of destruction or something. And their reasoning was, okay, why would you do that? Show us. And Iraqi said, please come, you UN inspectors, but we want to document it. So the UN inspectors went there and they kept going home. They didn't find anything. They kept going. And what they uncovered, what the reporters about these facilities were, they think that who you already use the weapon against its own people. Isn't that ridiculous? Right? And that's what. So when that came out later on in the report and discovery, this is a fact, right? So it wasn't, brought over there. So you could bring facilities here, we want to help, and they don't know they use that and they use that as a geopolitical stance, right? It's horrible. More than 10,000 people were killed, and there's no answers to that, to blame who, right? To blame anyone? There's no blame in that, because the people were gassed and people died, and then they could say that could be a subversive act. Like you understand? People are not too blind, and that's what happened in the first world attempt of the suicide trucks or the bombs that tried to put down the World Trade Center. And subsequently, what happened when Bush Senior, W was in, what happened in his stand at the school. And at that time, the first plane attacked the World Trade Center. So I don't find it amusing at all, right? So, and the insult to injury is, he didn't disconsider. It was after Bush was in there, and then the gas prices went up. And Americans were fed up because they're paying more for petrol and more for their gasoline to go to work, to pay their bills for the deficit. And that's when you realize who backed these type of adversaries were holy, the scriptures of the Quran or other religions that are backed by other factions. And the U.S. has a diplomatic surveillance, or not surveillance, contingencies with America. Like they build these ships and planes with Saudis, and they buying these planes from America. They're one of the biggest producers of those jumbo jets. Okay, now, after that, you saw Bush go there and then apologize to the Sultan of Saudi Arabia, right? Because, can you help us? But who's delivering those gas tankers? We know the shipping lines that they depended on, those guys were making money. Because they thought, lefta, right? Because now you're going to raise the price of gasoline, and that benefits everyone. So this is about high inflation taxation. And that's what happened. The cost of those goods cost dramatically more. So anyways, regardless of that, we're intertwined to say how, people want to know the right side of history and how invoking it can be when you're arguing all sides of the why you participated, right? It's a hard pill to swallow. It's a hard day to live along, to know then what entailed after the militias that so-called grew up. When countries disinfraction and you realize they left it in tethers and they're still asking why. So when we understand history and then we're putting in context, we ask, like Canadians, what we stood for as with peace initiative. To brag about one's country before the nuclear race began, war, like building bombs of that magnitude, they forgot what that meant. It didn't make you more powerful. It made more people more aware. So when they talk about Canada and its obligations about nuclear proliferation, we argue that in court. Because when we talk about two superpowers at that time only had that weapon, and you have more than 14 countries now that have it. So, they shouldn't be arguing about Canadian stance about its sovereignty and other NATO equipped countries who have that kind of armament. Right? It's a threat to our country and our sovereignty. So Canada should never be threatened by any hostile takeover or anything that indoctrines our sovereignty. You be very well aware. But because of the stance and the idea what should happen in Israel, and how we're talking about the context of people in plight of war, is no different than what happened in the outbreak of World War II in those 5 years. And nevertheless, when we talk about how certain faiths of Hebrew-speaking people would say, how would that be relevant today when you're talking about people in Gaza running for those same reasons, right? That's why when we talk about when Clinton and Yitzhak Rabin and Arafat wanted peace, at the same time, that helped the country, and they argue that point, which is the capitulation what we have with Netanyahu, right? Because at this time he saw a vacuum, and they found out what happened to Yitzhak Rabin, and you have to respect that in a way that it wasn't initiated by its enemy. So it's horrible to think how we let this war to continue and where we're parallel left with our lives, left among those ideas. So now there's destabilization and the tax bill of all this accumulated misery in that side of the world, right? And as Canadians, we know we gone there. It's not support of that idea, because then you have other people who in the last 2, 3, 4 generations, right, 30 years now, have migrated from other countries who are parallel and sanctioned by other countries and to come live here, right? And that's when the hostilities end and the greetings should begin. But unfortunately, what we have with our current federal liberals and its stance on about overwhelmingly supporting Israel and the dynamics of that when they're at war and their reasoning here. You see, it plays out a huge part, because when we're asking those countries who are later obligated or Canadian troops to go, we can't invoke our rights to warrant hostility if we in a situation where either you're hostile or not. Because when you got other dissidents who have lived their lives here many generations, who might live in Russia at one time or lived in other countries in South America, Argentina, or in Europe or former Yugoslavia. And then they would wear or garnish an American or maybe a Canadian reservist, and that invokes other things. So what's happening now and how they understand how war is outbrought, and now it's a different type of war when you talk about contagions, and you're talking about other dynamics that are beyond people's scope. So when people like that maybe would criticize Israel's stance, and like myself, about being in a context in line, there are ramifications when that outline now and where they see themselves. This is Ashna Garden and signing out.